Hello, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. And what a great pleasure it is for me to have now one of the greatest minds in understanding economics, understanding money, as is Dr. Hanke. Professor Steve Hanke is a professor of applied economics at the University of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He is also a fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., senior fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland, and senior advisor of the Renmin University of China's International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing, among so many other titles. I could go on forever. And so thank you so much for being here, Steve. Good to talk to you.
Good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
A great pleasure. One of the things that we seem to have forgotten in this crazy time is the importance of monetary aggregates and the importance of the creation of money. We've had the most rapid increase in inflation in 3 decades. Very, very recently, it seems to be coming down now, and we've heard all sorts of explanations about the burst of inflation. But from a monetary perspective, what is it that really drove inflation where it went?
Well, I think, Daniel, the thing to start with is going back to Milton Friedman, one of my old mentors. And as you recall, he had a couple of lines that I like. One is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now that means the money supply is driving the thing, and the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY, is the equation of exchange, and that's the essence of the whole thing. If you understand that identity, MV, M, money, V, velocity, equals P, the price level, Y, the real rate of growth in the economy, if you know how to deal with that identity and use it, you can pretty much hit the bullseye on where inflation is going. And if we go back to 2021, actually, John Greenwood and I were, I think, the first ones in the United States who actually put a number on where inflation was going. We said it would go, and we wrote this in the Wall Street Journal, by the way, in July. We had another piece in February of 2021 that warned about the oncoming inflation, but in July, we actually put numbers on it. We said it would reach maybe as high as 9% in the United States, a headline inflation number. Well, it did reach 9.1%. So we were pretty darn close with that using the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY. So that's one element for Friedman. The other element to keep in mind is that, to quote Friedman, monetary policy is not about interest rates, it's about the rate of growth in the money supply. And that's another nuance and critical thing, because everything you read in the newspapers, everything that central banks are talking about is interest rates, interest rates, interest rates. They've essentially canceled the quantity theory of money and canceled the idea that the money supply has a growth rate has anything whatsoever to do with inflation. Now, there are several reasons for this. One is, of course, the central banks engage in policies that affect the money supply. And if the money supply gets out of line and we have inflation or deflation, they don't want to be blamed for it. Mm-hmm. They want to put the finger on something else. You know, we had, remember, inflation was supposed to be a temporary thing. And it was caused by supply chain problems, the war in Ukraine, grain prices going up, this thing and that thing. Well, those were all changes, of course, in relative prices, oil, for example, and grain prices. But they, in fact, the inflation is a basket, it's a big aggregate that includes everything. So within the basket goes up and it goes down depending on MV equals PY, the quantity theory of money and changes in the money supply. But what goes on inside the basket, that's relative prices are moving all over the place. And the example I like to give on this is if we go back to the 1970s, Daniel, and look at Japan. Remember, we had two oil crises in the 1970s. The first one was the OPEC action in 1973, and that caused the relative price of oil to shoot way up. And the Bank of Japan decided that they would accommodate this increase in oil prices by letting the money supply increase. It did increase. And you had not only the relative price of oil going up, but you had general inflation going up in Japan. Then in 1979, we had another oil crisis. And what the Bank of Japan did, they said, oh, we're not going to play the game. We'll let the relative price of oil go up, but we're not going to goose the money supply. And as a result, yes, the price of oil went up relative to everything else, but the general price level did not go up in 1979. So that's kind of the proof of the pudding about this monetary causation, shall we say, of many things. And to get the transmission mechanism, we have to look at changes in the money supply. Mm-hmm. And once those are sustained one way or another, then with a lag of about 1 to 9 months, sensitive commodity prices and asset prices start changing. Equity prices, real estate, sensitive commodity prices, 1 to 9 month lag after the big changes in the money supply. Then with a lag of about 6 to 18 months, the real economic activity starts changing. That's real GDP. And then another lag, 12 to 24 months, we ultimately get inflation at the end of the line. And that's exactly what happened starting, back to your question, Daniel. You said, well, what are these big changes in the money supply? How have they worked, let's say, in the United States? Well, they worked as follows. Starting in February of 2020, we had a huge increase and acceleration in the money supply. And the average increase in the money supply in 2000 and 2021 was a little over 18%. That's unprecedented. We never had that kind of an increase in the United States. And with the lag, we got right away asset prices. Of course, the equity markets boomed, sensitive commodity prices boomed. Then with a lag of 16, 18 months, we had the real economy got very hot. And then sure enough, inflation came in and we got this record high inflation that we're facing. So that inflation was not caused by these relative price changes. It was caused by the money supply going up. It was not temporary, it was persistent. We're still in the grips of the thing winding down. So what should just how fast is 18% on average? If you solve for M in the MV equals PY equation and plug in the right numbers, you get what I call a golden growth rate. And the golden growth rate is a rate consistent with hitting the Fed's inflation target of 2%. And that's, for the US, it's about 5 to 6% M2 growth. Mm-hmm. That's the broadest measure that the Fed is measuring in the money supply. It isn't broad enough in my view, but that's as broad as they measure it. So about 5 to 6%. Well, the money supply was growing over 3 times faster than the golden growth rate. Of course, you were going to get inflation. Any idiot could have figured that out. And any idiot could have figured out that it was not going to be temporary and it was not caused by supply chains. It was caused by this huge increase in the money supply. Now, where are we? Getting back again to your original question, Daniel, the money supply for the last 10 months has been contracting in the United States. And if you look at the 3-month annualized rate of growth in the money supply now in the United States, the numbers just came out from Money Supply this week, it's minus 5.7%. If you look at the 6-month number, it's minus, on an annualized basis, minus 5.4%. This is unprecedented. We haven't had this since the 1930s. So the money supply is collapsing in the United States. And with these transmission lags that I went through earlier, that I won't repeat, we know that a big recession is baked in the cake already. It must happen with this kind of a huge contraction in the money supply. And by the way, to add to this, and looking forward just a little bit, if one of the only positive contributor to the money supply growth in the last 6 months or so has been bank loans, bank credit.
Yeah.
And that actually has been, it hasn't been it's been slowing down. It is not in negative territory yet, but look at this. The bank credit is down now on a 6-month annualized rate. It's about 3%. It's slowed way down. It was up about 12% earlier in the year. In January, it was actually 11.94%, the 6-month annualized rate. So it's coming down very sharply. Now let's talk about the Silicon Valley Bank and these other banking problems that you've been analyzing. That plays into the picture because it's gotten political. Number one, let's assume there were no changes in any bank regulations or anything like that. The banks would naturally hunker down, and probably rein in credit. So this number might actually go negative, which will be a negative, instead of a positive contribution to the money supply, it would be a negative, pulling that aggregate down even faster. But now the Biden administration and Washington, in all their wisdom, has said, oh, banks are the bad guys. It's 2008 again. 2008, the banks are the bad guys. We have to squeeze the banks, regulate the banks more, increase their capital asset ratios and liquidity ratios and all these things. That is going to squeeze the bank loans and bank credit down even further, which will cause, I'm anticipating, even more problems with this money supply thing, because the Fed is still engaged in quantitative tightening, running off their balance sheet, and the commercial banks, which are the biggest contributor actually to the money supply, they're going to rein in things. So I think we not only have a recession baked in the cake, given that what we've already experienced and the usual lags that accompany those changes in money supply, I'm anticipating the money supply for now is going to keep contracting.
Yeah.
But one related aspect of that first question, which actually includes a lot of embedded other questions, is why the Fed has canceled the quantity theory of money. The Chairman Powell has gone out of his way to say that changes in the money supply have no predictable effect on economic activity and inflation. He's testified on this over and over and over again. And what you have is post-Keynesian economic models really drive. So that there's a theoretical reason for this. For the last 30 years, all macroeconomists have been fed these post-Keynesian type of economic models, and those models don't include money. Exactly. Money is not included in the model. So that's one reason. That's kind of a theoretical, educational kind of thing. I think there's also another very political thing, and that is that there are 785 economists in the Federal Reserve System. By the way, using their post-Keynesian models, none of them could predict that we were going to have inflation. John Greenwood and I did predict it using MV equals PY. But none of the 785 economists at the Fed predicted inflation. None of their models predicted it. So that gets into the composition, the political composition of the 785. And if you look at just the 416 in Washington, the 416 economists in Washington, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is 48.5 to 1.
Wow.
There are almost 50 Democrats for every Republican that's on the staff, economic staff. Now you say, well, what's this have to do with anything? Well, it has a lot to do with it because, as you know, the champion of the quantity theory of money was who? Milton Friedman. And he's a target of any Democrat. In fact, in 2020, Joe Biden, who was then running for president, said, "We're lucky that Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore." So you can see Friedman has kind of a target on his back for any Democrat. They're always going to be going after Milton Friedman. And what was one of the things that Milton Friedman embraced and was the big champion of was the quantity theory of money and monetarism.
Yeah. It is absolutely amazing, no? One of the things that I think create this perverse incentive, obviously, is the fact that they can immediately go to any other excuse and use, as you said before, cost push inflation, supply chain disruptions, etc. Although I always remind people here in the Eurozone, we must remember that we had $150 barrel oil and we didn't have 9-10% inflation. We had 3% inflation. No, so it all depends on the quantity of money, and that what they call cost push inflation is also a monetary effect, because commodities don't rise all at the same time if it's not a larger amount of money going to relatively scarce assets. Commodities, I always say, are not a cause of inflation, but a consequence of inflation. You get a lot more money going into storage, margin calls, and long positions in commodities. One of the things that that you just mentioned is that on the one hand, they've completely forgotten about money or ignored money in their analysis, and that there's also a political view. And obviously there's this constantly becoming more popular view that deficit spending is not a problem, that deficit spending is creating reserves for the private sector, that the higher the deficit, the better for the economy. The so-called modern monetary theory, which is not modern and is not a theory, it's always been implemented everywhere. No, do you think that is what ultimately they're moving into?
Well, let me first mention one thing about the Eurozone, because we just got the new inflation number for the Eurozone.
Yeah.
And everyone was shocked that it collapsed. It's fell. It's 6.9% now. Mm-hmm. And it was
8.5. No, something like
8.5. It went from 8.5 to 6.9. So everyone was surprised. I was not surprised. And the reason why I wasn't surprised will be the same reason you weren't surprised. The money supply has been collapsing in the Eurozone.
Exactly.
If you look at the 3-month annualized rate of return, rate of increase in the money supply, it's contracting by minus 5.58%, about 0.5%.
Yeah.
And the same thing, the 6-month annualized rate of change in the money supply, again, this time measured by M3. They have a little broader measure in the Eurozone than we do in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's about 0.5%. It's declining. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we know these lags come in, and all of a sudden inflation is coming down. And I read the papers this morning, the Financial Times, for example, they go on and on about, oh, oil prices have come down.
Yeah.
That's the reason inflation has come down. They just don't get it. There's no mention of money supply in
No.
any of these inflation reports whatsoever. Now, Daniel, this gets back to one of my rules, and I have a rule. It's called Hankey's 95% rule.
Yeah.
95% of what you read in the press is either wrong or irrelevant. And today it's just filled, all the commentary about this sudden drop in inflation in Eurozone is absolute rubbish.
Yeah. And the figure of M3 that the ECB publishes is very interesting because the annual growth has gone from 8.5% to 4.5% to 2%, which means that the rate of change, the collapse in the rate of change is so drastic that what's interesting is to see where it's coming from, because the credit impulse in the Eurozone has plummeted, absolutely collapsed. So because on the other hand, government deficits and consumption of monetary units through government spending, that has not changed dramatically. So it's basically coming from the credit impulse of the private sector. And it's really scary because of the ramifications that may lead to, as you have just mentioned, with the lag that you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, the thing that you're talking about now, this credit impulse thing, is very important, because if you look at, now we're getting into the weeds a little bit, but this is what you have to be able to do. People ask me, well, how do you actually analyze the money supply? Why do you know what's going on, and so forth? Well, number one, they don't even publish the money supply very frequently in the United States anymore. But if you look at the consolidated balance sheet of the commercial banks and of obviously the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, remember our friend Sir John R. Hicks once said, a high priest of economic theory, he said that there's nothing more important than a balance sheet. So you have to look at the balance sheets. So you were, and if you look at the balance sheet, if the commercial banks, you can get the monetary liabilities. Then you look at the balance sheet of the central bank, you get the monetary liabilities. If you add the two things up, you get the money supply. But the question you got into is the critical one, and that is, you said credit impulse. So that's looking at the consolidated balance sheet of the commercial banks, and what people have to learn how to do. And in America, they don't know how to do this, by the way. Some Europeans do. You have to do a credit counterpart analysis to see what's driving the monetary liabilities on the liability side of the balance sheets. You have to look at the asset side and what's changing on the asset side, and that will tell you why the money supply is moving around. You put your finger on it. You called it credit impulse. It's loans being made by the commercial banks in Europe has collapsed, and that's why the M3 money supply is being drugged down.
Mm-hmm. Completely. When you think of the next steps, what we have seen now is that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has recovered, has gone up quite a bit, almost unwound 70% by now of the quantitative tightening through loans to the commercial banks, short-term loans. However, many people are making the mistake of thinking that is the same as quantitative easing, which it is not. I believe you would agree with that, and it may have a very severe impact on money velocity, because it increases the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, but it does not go to more credit or to more activity or more investment. It just basically regurgitates in the balance sheet in order to preserve the deposit base. How do you see that?
So this is a very important thing and that most people are confused about. You aren't, but most people are, and that is, yes, those are temporary loans. They're being made. They're liquidity, short-term liquidity injection. They're the Bagehot rule. They are being loaned at a penalty interest rate to the commercial banking sector. So it looks like the balance sheet's going up, but quantitative tightening is still in place.
Exactly.
Quantitative tightening is even if the Fed funds rate, just the last meeting they had, it increased by 25 basis points. Okay, assume that even stays just the same. They don't make any change, but they keep quantitative tightening on. That is going to drag the money supply down. M2 goes down. It's going down. So this temporary liquidity injection has essentially no effect on the overall money supply growth whatsoever. Most people are just confused by that. And the reason why ultimately gets back to Sir John R. Hicks, there's nothing more important than a balance sheet. Well, that's fine, but you have to know how to read the balance sheet. And since most people don't pay any attention to the money supply, they've completely forgotten how to read a balance sheet if they ever knew for the central banks. So that's a very important point that you make, because most people are just completely confused on that. It's like the confusion, Daniel, that accompanied 2008, the Great Recession. So we go back to 2008, and what happened? We had a subprime crisis, mortgage-backed security crisis, and that was very much tangled up with the banks and the banking systems, savings and loans, and so forth. And at that time, Washington, D.C. said the bankers were bad and the banks were bad. And they passed something called the Dodd-Frank legislation, which put many more regulations and a squeeze on banks, required them to increase their capital asset ratios. And at about the same time, by the way, Basel III came, and that mandated increasing capital asset ratios at banks. Now, to do that, what do you have a capital over assets. So to increase that, you can either issue new shares and get more capital. Well, that was a no-go, because the banks didn't want to dilute their existing shareholders. So what do? You look at the denominator and you try to reduce that. So you rein in loans.
Yeah.
And so they met all the regulations, but as a result, the banks started making a negative contribution to M2.
Yeah.
They were the biggest contributor to M2. It started going down. So the Fed at the time, Ben Bernanke was the chairman, as you recall, the Federal Reserve. They had quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. And a lot of people said, oh, the balance sheet's exploding at the central bank. We're going to have hyperinflation. A lot of gold bugs, by the way, were saying, oh, we're going to have hyperinflation. They didn't know what they were talking about, because on the one hand, the big contributor to the money supply, the private, by the way, most money is created privately.
Yeah.
It's not created by the central bank. It's by the commercial banks. And the fractional reserve system is creating money. Well, that stopped with the Dodd-Frank regulations and Basel III, and it went into reverse, actually. It started going down.
That's why the money velocity collapsed. Yeah.
The Fed, fortunately, actually entered quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. If they hadn't, we would have had a Great Depression.
So it's a very important point, that one that you mentioned. Because a lot of people,
as a result, remember the quantitative easing. By the way, if you added both the commercial bank's contribution and the Fed's contribution together, the money supply never grew very fast. It was only growing like 5.5%, 6%, almost the golden growth rate. we never had inflation.
Because
We
money velocity as well was collapsing. Money velocity was coming
right.
down.
So this gets into understanding the importance of the Federal Reserve and the commercial banking system, looking at the balance sheets of the consolidated commercial banking system and the Fed, and being able to understand all these things. Most people just don't.
Yeah.
I mean, they wouldn't know how to analyze a balance sheet if you hit them in the head with a thing.
Even less so the balance sheet of a bank, which is even more challenging.
Yes.
Which brings me to the question of interest rates, because central banks continue to increase rates, okay, which reduces credit growth. Central banks are looking at the same time at quantitative tightening, while the banking crisis of Silicon Valley, Signature, Credit Suisse, Deutsche, you name it, all of those are inevitably going to lead to a tighter level of credit growth. So we can find ourselves in a situation in which the two drivers of money growth actually go in reverse very, very quickly in a very short period of time.
Well, yes. Now, I agree with your analysis completely. And this means, given the past behavior of the money supply and the lags that are associated with it, we know we're going to have a recession. Your point is that the recession might be a lot deeper and last a lot longer than people think, because going forward, you and I happen to think that maybe this tightening squeeze will continue because the central banks, why? Because the central banks don't know what they're doing. They're not watching the money supply. They're flying blind. They're focusing, by the way, on the interest rate. And that gets back to Milton Friedman's quote that I gave at the start of our session. And that is, monetary policy is not about interest rates. It's about the rate of growth in the money supply. They're not looking at the money supply. So they're flying blind. I mean, they're flying in an airplane, and the altimeter should have what on it? The money supply. It has nothing on it, or maybe it has the interest rate on it. And you mentioned, well, the interest rate does affect credit, but that's kind of a fuzzy relationship.
Credit growth,
right. You know, that depends on a lot of things. There have been times when the federal funds rate in the United States, by the way, there have been 3 occasions since 1980 in which the federal funds rate they've increased tremendously, and credit growth in the banks continues to increase. And why did that happen? It happened because the demand for credit was hot. The economy was hot. Everyone was optimistic. Now, look at the picture now. We've got a war. We've got a war going on in Europe, an ill-advised, dangerous war. So that, and we've got these banking problems, and we've got all kinds of political uncertainty. Whatever country you go to, there's a lot of political uncertainty about who's running the show and what's going on. A lot of division and so forth. That is not an environment in which you have entrepreneurs being very optimistic, and they say, "Oh, I don't care if the interest rate's going up. I'm borrowing money because I got a good business that I want to start." And this is something you've written about, and I agree with it. I've been thinking about it too. This idea of capital destruction.
Yeah.
Now the capital destruction thing, as one thing that does happen with interest rates going up, is that the present value of assets goes down.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of capital destruction. Now that comes back into the balance sheets of not only obviously the enterprises that have seen their values go down, but the banking system.
Yeah.
And that's something you work on. You and I completely agree on that.
Yeah.
By the way.
Yeah.
This gets into Austrian economics. They call it the structure of production. And so what happened when we had this artificial zero interest rate, negative interest rate environment for a long time in the COVID kind of period, you had the structure of production being very distorted. You had investments being made in long-term assets with much longer duration than should have been made under normal circumstances. Well, now all that's being pulled back because interest rates are going up.
Absolutely.
So the duration of the whole thing is shrinking. The structure of production is changing and adjusting. And as you put it in your terms, you say a lot of capital destruction.
It's completely true, and I think that the point is probably that it's going to make it even more difficult in a period in which, by the time that it happens, the different ways to address it take a lot longer. And by now, central banks have already made the mistakes too far, and at the same time, the situation in banks is not strong enough, and certainly at the economic level, the confidence is not strong enough. We are running out of time, but it's been a tremendous conversation, Steve. What a great opportunity to chat with you. And what I would like to recommend absolutely everybody is to follow you on Twitter. Absolutely essential. You want to check inflation, you want to check money, you need to follow Steve. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope that we can continue not too long from now. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Look forward to being with you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.